Following the failure of the Meech Lake Accord in 1990, a series of negotiations took place among the federal government, the provincial governments, the territorial governments, and this time included representatives from various First Nations, Métis, and Inuit organizations. 2 years later, these negotiations resulted in a new accord, the Charlottetown Accord, in 1992. This accord was a far-reaching series of reforms and measures in order to strengthen the power of the provinces, recognize Quebec as a distinct society, and reform the Senate. The Charlottetown Accord also recognized Aboriginal rights to self-government, making Indigenous governments analogous to the provincial government, so essentially creating a new level of government for Indigenous peoples that would deal directly with Ottawa and would be completely autonomous. The exact parameters of this type of government were to be decided in future negotiations. So the Charlottetown Accord gave Quebec pretty much what it would have been promised in the Meech Lake discussions, and nothing more. So what many Quebecers felt was the bare minimum of reforms to the Constitution that they were willing to accept. In order to gain the agreement from other provinces on the Distinct Society Clause, which many had been opposed to, Mulroney had to convince Robert Bourassa to agree to Senate reforms that would see equal provincial representation in the Senate. So rather than Quebec having regional representation, which we have now, which allows Quebec as its own region to have an unequal number of seats compared to other provinces, this would have given all provinces equal representation in the Senate. This was especially galling to Quebec nationalists. Way back in 1866, when the Constitution, the British North America Act, was being negotiated, Quebec had agreed to representation that would ensure that French speakers had a somewhat equal voice to English speakers in the Senate, so that they would never be in the minority completely. They saw Canada as a partnership between two founding nations, not between 10 equal provinces, which of course there had only been 4 provinces in 1867, not 10. Bourassa accepted these terms only after other provinces agreed that in exchange for having equal representation in the Senate, the powers of the Senate would be somewhat reduced. The Charlottetown Accord also proposed a social charter that would promote such objectives as healthcare, welfare, education, environmental protection, and collective bargaining, and enshrine these rights in the Constitution. Deviating from the experience of Meech Lake, Mulroney decided that rather than having each province ratify the accord, he would hold a national referendum on the Charlottetown Accord. So this was Mulroney's attempt to kind of circumvent a lot of the politics that had prevented Meech Lake from being ratified, and to directly ask the Canadian population what they think. This was only the 3rd referendum of its kind in Canadian history. The first in 1898 had been on the issue of prohibition, alcohol prohibition. The second had been on the issue of conscription during the Second World War in 1942. So they agreed to the terms in August of 1992, and the referendum was held in October of 1992. I want to play you a clip from that time shortly before the referendum. It's probably
Wellness isn't a destination.
Okay, we don't need to watch the advertising. Okay.
Blue Cross.
The CBC's Paul Adams now with a brief version of how Canada has tried to solve its national puzzle.
I suppose as exciting as watching paint dry this morning, but
Canada's revolving door, the constitutional talk that never seems to end.
We're all fed up with this constitution, like let's move on.
A lot of Canadians are suffering from constitutional fatigue.
I don't know of anybody that I know that is not dead tired.
At its most trivial, there's boredom and an agonizingly slow and complex debate.
Very difficult.
At its most serious, anger that national problems like the recession and the personal tragedies they bring with them are being ignored.
Why should $125 million be spent on an issue of unity when the very issue of feeding each other isn't even being dealt with today?
Now all of us are getting copies of the Charlottetown Accord dropped through the mail slot, and its backers are saying it could put an end to all the constitutional talk, the frustrating debate that sometimes seems like the Canadian curse.
There are worse ways for countries to settle their problems. In September of 1864, Americans were sorting out their cultural differences in the bloodiest war in human history to that time. That same month in Charlottetown, PEI, the Fathers of Confederation began talking about what they hoped would be a more peaceful union of peoples and provinces. They came up with the British North America Act, Canada's original constitution. Not much more than an organizational chart, really, dividing up powers between Ottawa and the provinces. But it worked well enough for 100 years or so, and Canadians were able to get on with other things.
That the people of Quebec have had enough of the present system.
And then something dramatically changed. Seeking to become masters in their own house, many Quebecers demanded stronger powers for the province. And the talk began.
And the people of Canada decide if they want to try.
A decade and a half later, all the governments except Quebec agreed on the 1982 Constitution Act. It was a profound change. By listing individual rights from free speech to women's equality, it transformed the Constitution from an organizational chart for governments into a citizen's charter.
But for many Quebecers, individual rights were never the goal. They were concerned about the survival of their entire society and the powers they felt Quebec needed to protect it. It was that demand for collective rights that Meech Lake was meant to address, with its greater provincial powers and recognition of the distinct society.
Trouble was, Quebec wasn't the only group in Canada laying claim to new rights.
And we can't put up with that any longer.
Native people were demanding the power and resources to rescue their communities, and many Westerners wanted protection from the domination of Quebec and Ontario.
They are desperate men looking for desperate solutions, and what they hold up to ransom each and every day are the emotions and the commitment to this nation of the Canadian people, and they don't give a damn.
They felt excluded, and it killed Meech Lake. So this time Ottawa decided it would be different. Don Getty brought his demand for a Triple E Senate to this round of talks. Slowly a consensus developed to adopt a version of the idea. Ovid Mercredi brought his demand for an inherent right of self-government. Gradually defined and refined, the concept was accepted even if the application remains unclear. And Robert Bourassa came once again looking for new powers and the distinct society. The debate in Quebec is whether he got enough. The agreement they reached, the so-called Charlottetown Accord, is easily the most massive set of proposed constitutional changes since 1867. Yet there are literally dozens of areas left to be filled in by future legislation, litigation, or negotiation. Not minor issues either. Left to be decided, the economic union that Ottawa said was a major goal during these talks. The issue of women's equality in the Senate. New provincial powers. The details will have to be negotiated province by province. And Aboriginal self-government. There could be 200 or more separate negotiations to decide how it would work in each community. The issue among the politicians is whether all these talks yet to come would absorb and distract Canada the way the talks just past have done.
Far from bringing the current round of constitutional wrangling to an end, a yes vote will deepen and broaden and perpetuate it.
Approval of this agreement can put the Constitution on the back burner, out of the headlines, where it belongs.
The backers of the Charlottetown Accord say it will bring not only constitutional peace, but also prosperity. The claim, which their opponents heatedly dispute, is that a yes vote would allow Canadians to get on with other things. Paul Adams, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, so this... hang on a second. So this clip talks about some of the backstory, as well as what proponents and opponents of the Accord were saying.